Good morning. As you can imagine, I'm a little nervous, just a little bit. So we're going to pray, because that always helps. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord. Amen. So we're going back in time. We've got our time machine, we're traveling back. Not all the way back, because we're after Adam and Eve. We're after Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, after Moses and 40 years of wandering. After years and years of judges, came King Saul and a boy named David. David is considered to be a man after God's own heart. But before he could become a man after God's own heart, he had to be a boy. He was a shepherd boy. He spent a lot of time outdoors with the sheep. And don't let anybody tell you that that would be an easy job. He was a protector. He was a comforter. He had to fight against bears. He had to fight against lions. He had to fight against the weather and the terrain. He was the youngest child of 8. And he was already anointed, when our story starts, already anointed as the future king of Israel. So David had to defeat a giant. You see, Jesse, David's father, sent him to the front line where his older brothers were to check and make sure everything was okay. David gets there, he hears the words of Goliath, and he sees that all the men of Israel are ready to run away. They're cowering in fear. They're afraid of the army of the Philistines. David, being a teenage boy, is ready to fight. Sometimes that mentality, the teenage boy mentality of fight or flight, they have the fight. They have the fight. And as a parent, it's not my favorite instinct. It's probably the one that I would be the least wanting them to continue to reproduce. I'm flight all the way. I am flight all the way, especially for my kids. But David is ready to fight, and after all, he had killed a lion, and he had killed a bear to save his sheep. So what was this Philistine to him? He knew that God had a plan, that he was already anointed as the future king. So whatever was happening that day was not going to happen the way everybody else thought it was going to happen. He trusted in God, had faith in God, that God was who he says he is. So when Saul, who is so desperate, King Saul is desperate for a deliverer, he hears the report of David's words, and he offers his armor to David, but David, being a teenage boy, can't fit into a man's armor. From 1 Samuel chapter 17:40, this is what David did. He took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. And he put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near the Philistine. You see, David approached Goliath with the armor of a shepherd. He had a staff or a club. He had 5 smooth stones out of a brook, a shepherd's bag to hold the stones, and a sling in his hand. And he had faith in God. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." So not just belief, but real faith. Faith that God is who he says he is, and that God can do what he says he will do. Moving forward, our next example is in the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see, there was a reason Jackie chose those songs for the kids to sing today. This is one of the best known stories in the Bible because it is special to us. It teaches that taking a stand for God, having absolute faith, always pays off in the end. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were young boys when they, along with Daniel and many other Hebrews, they were captured by the Babylonian invaders and taken back to Babylon to serve King Nebuchadnezzar. This is years after David. This is now during the time of the diaspora. As time passed, these youths were elevated to places of authority within the kingdom, and even though they were in positions of prominence, they found themselves facing a life or death decision. They could stand for the Lord and face death, or they could deny God and live. These boys chose to stand for the Lord, and because they did, they were thrown into a terrible fiery furnace. In spite of the danger, in spite of threats, in spite of the wrath of a pagan god, these young men held tight to their testimonies and their faith. Not only were they saved from the furnace, but a figure appeared with them in the flames. This figure, described as the king, was looking like a son of the gods. And the king of Persia, was amazed and praised the Lord. Our third example is from Esther, who lived about 100 years after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. At this time, many of the dispersed Jews were already assimilated into the Persian culture. Unlike Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Esther didn't remember any other way of life. She had always lived in the city. She lived with her cousin Mordecai after the death of her own parents. And through a series of events, you really got to read the book, she became the queen of Persia during the time when a Jewish queen was needed to save the entire population from annihilation. God placed her at that point in history for such a time as this. So what do these three stories have in common? Well, for one thing, these are just kids. These were children. In today's time, they would not have been able to buy a glass of wine. They would not have been able to vote. They would not have been able to drive. Yet each of these children had already had the seed of the Lord's wisdom planted in them. So kudos to their parents, to their teachers, to their guardians, as they had obviously already been taught that God is the one true God, the only one worth putting your life on the line for. How many of us would do the same? There's a children's ministry leader in Texas named Mike Johnson. And he says that doing the right things at the most difficult of times only happens through God's help and through godly morals. One of my favorite quotes is actually on the door to Aaron in my office, says, if we don't teach our children to follow Christ, the world will teach them not to. Can I have the slide, please? Children begin gaining moral values around the age of 2, and it increases until it peaks around between the ages of 10 and 13. After that, it starts to decline. Between the age of 2 and 10, what is learned is internalized. A child has a difficult time going against the moral upbringing of its youth. I still find this to be true. Some of my parents' friends, I will still call them by their last name. It will always be Mr. Windish and Mrs. Patini. It will always be that. Because even though now we're more peers than ever before in our lives, it feels disrespectful to call them anything else. In Mark 4, Jesus tells the story about the seeds. Emily read that passage to you earlier today. Jesus was speaking to a small group of Galilean fishermen who must have wondered how they could ever really make an impact in the world. And when Matthew and Mark and Luke first told those stories, they were speaking to persecuted churches trying to survive the might of an often hostile Roman Empire in the 80s and the 90s. Jesus was saying things may look bleak, but never underestimate what God can do. Why? Because every seed has within it potential. A seed can bear fruit 30, 60, 100 times of what was planted. Each rice seed, mustard seed, each ear of corn, each pumpkin seed, tiny as an urt as it seems, has within it the potential to become a plant that provides an abundant harvest. Each child born has within them the potential to become a God-following adult. Like Jesus' hearers, we live in an often harsh and brutal world. The horrific events brought on by ISIS, concerns over Ebola, hurricanes and their aftermath, Any of these could lead us to despair about human nature, the good seemingly trampled underfoot. But Jesus says, keep sowing, keep planting seeds of faith. Keep sowing the seeds of hope and peace and love and justice in the world. And yes, some of our seeds will be trampled and choked. Sometimes these seeds just seem to be trampled underfoot by brutal regimes, blown away by callous terrorists, or simply withered and scorched by selfish indifference of so-called respectable people. But God says, keep planting seeds, keep on sowing. Trust the seed of God's love. We sow seeds. We also seek to nurture and care for seeds that were planted by ourselves and by others. Because for each seed to reach its potential, it needs the right conditions to thrive and to flourish. In the parable of the sower, the seeds that were not planted in the right conditions or nurtured and tended, they withered and perished because life, particularly in its early stages, is fragile. Plants need the right care and attention to bear fruit. Babies need love and nurturing to grow. Children need care and attention to grow and continue to learn. Youths need attention and guidance and love so that they can reach their full potential as loving, Christ-serving adults. Adults need to believe that the daily grind of life is not all there is, that God can and will continue to use them to bring about his kingdom here on earth. Every human being, no matter what age, needs love in order to thrive. And nobody loves like our triune God. I love my husband. I love my children, my Tori, my Evan. It's a fierce kind of mother love for my children that is occasionally irrational and often overwhelming, especially to them. And I know that God's love for them makes my love look weak and superficial. So I can only hope that my love is a doorway to accepting God's love. This is good ground. This is the good ground that is needed so that any seed can reach its maturity. So let us as a church, as Christians who live in a world not our own, continue to provide that ground, that growing environment of love and peace and justice that these seeds may grow. There are many ways where we can grow seeds. We can nurture the harvest of love, peace, and justice by giving our money and seeing it produce a harvest for the poor. By saying your prayers, because one small prayer can produce a very rich harvest. By bringing your children or grandchildren to church each week. Now, many of you would say that this is not possible, that your family might not be local. So I'd say use your influence in their world. Use your influence in the lives of your children and your grandchildren and ask them about attending a church regularly. Set an expectation that seeds are being planted. You can also live simply so that others can simply live. You can sow 1,000,000 small acts of love and peace and justice into your lives and live out the gospel. These are the seeds of the Spirit which can be nurtured to produce the great harvest of the kingdom. Earlier, Pastor Tim said that in a couple of weeks we are going to be celebrating our first 50 years. That's a wonderful milestone to hit. But these children that are here today on their stage and in our pews, these are our next 50 years. Shannon Strobar could be your worship leader. She could be your choir director 50 years from now. Guy could be your pastor. That was for you, Michelle. Grant could be the head usher or the head of the finance committee. You know that Grace is going to be in the choir because she has such talented parents, grandparents. So these are the seeds. This is the future. Because I can tell you that 50 years from now, I probably won't be here. But these children can be, and they will be, as long as we love and nurture them. So finally, let me leave you with the words of Oscar Romero. He was a Roman Catholic archbishop. He lived in El Salvador, and he was martyred in 1980. It's actually on the back of your sermon notes and quotes, if you'd like to read along. One person plants a seed in the soil, another waters it. We plant seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. What we do may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an important opportunity of God's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders. Ministers, not messiahs. We are the prophets of a future, not our own. So let us sow the seed and trust God for the harvest. Thank you.